This last summer, our daughter Katie and I took a trip out east. We went to New York City and to Boston, and though we drove out there, when we were in those two cities, we actually used public transportation. I thought it was a lot better than driving in downtown Manhattan. It was true. That was a scary place to drive. The Twin Cities, piece of cake. Anyways, when we were there, we used public transportation, mostly the subways. And though it took us a little while, we were rather proud of ourselves. We kind of got the hang of the subways, which line to take and where it went and where the connections were and all that kind of stuff. And because we don't have subways in Deerwood, it was a new experience for me. On a cold day like this, we might want subways or skywalks, but not sure where they would come from or go to. But there are lots of places, and you go to a subway station, and you would often see a musician playing a guitar with a guitar case in front of them, saxophone players, same thing, case in front of them. And they did so, well, I suppose because it's part of the subway culture, but also I would imagine that that's one of the ways that they provide for themselves. It's how they make a living. That's how they pay their bills and put food on their tables. Several years ago, the Washington Post videotaped a street musician and all the crowds passing them. And some stopped and listened. It was a violin player in this case. And some listened and threw a buck in or two and then went on their ways. It was a busy commute. Not very many people paid much attention to this, just another street performer. Except this wasn't just another street performer. This was Joshua Bell, one of the world's greatest violin players, playing an instrument that cost several $1 million. Just a few nights before they videotaped this, Joshua Bell had actually been in Boston. This happened in New York. It happened in Washington, D.C. But anyways, he was in Boston a few nights before. And people paid over $100 a ticket to hear him play the very same songs he was playing at that subway station. Now, I've mentioned this before. I think I even showed you a clip several years ago. But the reason I thought about it this week is I was reading in the Star Trib this past week that the locked out musicians of the Minnesota Orchestra are going to be putting on a number of their own concerts away from management, and Joshua Bell will be featured with the Minnesota Orchestra musicians. So I was thinking, I was just kind of triggered my memory again, and also that instant, that experiment, if you will, in the subway station in Washington, D.C., I think is a great illustration of what is going on in our Advent texts for this third Sunday in Advent. Because it's all about God bursting in, God arriving, something extraordinary happening right in the midst of our ordinary or mundane or regular type of lives. Maybe even breaking in the midst of circumstances of our lives that are difficult. Circumstances where we might have heavy hearts. Circumstances that might veil our ability to see or to perceive what's really going on. God at work right now in our midst. In our first Bible reading from Isaiah, the people of Israel were experiencing some desert times. I'm thinking, when I think desert times, Middle East, I'm thinking hot and arid, and if you've watched the news, had a snowstorm over there. So the imagery is not quite right for this weekend, but I'm thinking desert times, dry, arid, alone, lonely, tough. Maybe the snow is tough. There was an army lined up against them. It was the army of Babylon, the superpower of the days, and the fear that gripped their heart, their collective heart, shattered the economy, shattered their lives, shattered the society, crippled it. But into that dark situation, if you will, that arid situation, that desert situation, came some hopeful and hope-filled words from the prophet Isaiah. prophet said, the desert will blossom with flowers. They'll become green. God will come and save you. You might not see it now, but yes, the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, the lame will leap, and those who cannot speak will shout and even sing with joy. God will come and save you. And somehow, right there in the midst of all that darkness and tough times, even though things didn't look good, that word of God opened up some eyes of faith, eyes of hope, and people caught just a little glimpse in the midst of all of what God would do. Maybe that's what we need today. Maybe that's what you need today. A glimpse of what God has promised to do and what God indeed is already doing. Already doing. John the Baptist, in our reading from Matthew, was also experiencing tough times. First, he was literally in prison, literally on death row. Things didn't look good for John, and he knew it. And secondly, there was this gnawing, wondering, or doubting, or questioning, either on his part or on the part of his disciples, John's disciples, about whether the Messiah, whether Jesus was the one whom they've been waiting for. And there was this gnawing, this doubt, this questioning, because Jesus wasn't acting like they thought the Messiah should act. Jesus was not meeting the people's expectations. John or his disciples or the people in general thought that the Messiah would free them from oppression by those Romans. They thought that the Messiah would lead them in a military victory. They thought that the Messiah would lead in that time that all of Israel had hoped for, when Israel would once again be restored to its glory, be restored to all of the promised land that they had once held under King David, which is where we are in the story, and we'll return to that after the new year. And so they prayed for this kind of Messiah. They prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed, and they waited for an answer. You might remember the story about a woman who was searching for the perfect birthday card for her husband. And she decided on one that on the outside read, "Sweetheart, you're the answers to my prayers." On the inside, it said, "You're not exactly what I prayed for, but apparently you're the answer." John had prayed for the Messiah, but not exactly the kind of Messiah that Jesus turned out to be. But he did learn, and John's disciples learned, and I hope we learn, that Jesus was in fact the answer. When they asked Jesus, "Are you the one who is to come? Or are we to wait for another?" Jesus didn't answer, "Why, yes, I am." But he did say, using imagery and words from the prophet Isaiah that we heard this morning, "Tell John what you hear and see. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." And being good Jews, John and his disciples knew their scriptures. They knew that if and when all of these things were happening around them, it could only mean one thing, that God had come, indeed had come. And all of a sudden, even there in the midst of prison, or in the midst of that darkness of doubt, or in the midst of a situation that absolutely did not look very good, God's hopeful and hope-filled words burst in. Those hope-filled promises burst in on them. And they could see clearly now with eyes that were opened, with eyes of hope and faith. They could see with eyes of the Spirit opened. Eyes that were previously, or had been previously veiled by preoccupation with struggle, by preoccupation with busyness. How are your eyes? Are they veiled with those things? The story of John and his disciples is about encountering the world with hopeful eyes and seeing and hearing what is going on right in their midst, in spite of all the negative stuff around them. And today what I'm suggesting is that their story can be your story too. When you live Adventually. Adventually. You know how Nick Zimmer signs his letters? Eventually yours. And for those of you who don't know who Nick Zimmer is, if you're watching on the internet, he's our local funeral director. Eventually yours. Now, I don't know who said it or who wrote it, but I either heard or read somewhere, sometime, how's that for footnoting something, that someone said, eventually, this is why I thought of it, eventually we die. Adventually we live. Adventually we live. Today, that's what I'm inviting you into. Adventually living. And there are two pieces of this adventually living. The first is to respond to this call this morning to see and to hear what God is up to in the here and the now, rather than obsessing with what of our agenda God is not doing. What of our expectations God is not meeting. What do I mean by that? You know, God might not have prevented a loved one from dying. God might not have healed you of a disease. You might want to place fault with God for any tragedy, crisis, or struggle that you have or are experiencing. You might think that God should have done something for you to prevent that or to get you out of that. I think we all know those kind of frustrations. But I need to remind myself and you that God didn't promise any of that. God didn't promise any of that. God promised and promises to love us. God promised and promises to be with us always to the end of the age, Jesus said. God promised and promises to embrace us and to walk with us. That's what God promised. But in the midst of all of that stuff in our lives, living adventually means seeing where God is at work. Not where He's not at work. Where God is at work. In relationships. In growing our faith. In prodding us, nudging us, guiding us, leading us. In developing in you or in us the fruit of the Spirit. Love, peace, joy, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. how are you being blessed? How are you being blessed in all that God is doing all around you? And can you see it? Seeing that is living adventually, full of expectation of encountering God and God's activity now. Now, I said there are two parts to living adventually. The first is to be aware, open, hear, see what God is up to. But the second is to actually be that coming, to be that advent, to be that appearing of God for others who are in their own prisons of doubt, for others who are in their own prisons of brokenness, of despair, of depression, of hopelessness, so that they too can hear of joy and leap for joy and shout and sing for joy. What do I mean? What do I mean by that? How can I do that? Yeah, I know I'm supposed to. Leonard Sweet, he's an author and guru of all things church, professor. He wrote this. I'm quoting this now. You can discover the gifts of Christmas, not just by opening presents under a tree, but by giving to the local food bank, or providing for a child in need for the local giving tree, or joining Heifer International, or by sponsoring a child from one of the international child care services, or by getting a pound puppy instead of a designer dog. I don't know about that one. Or by sending water filters to countries suffering from both floods and droughts, or by embracing the generations that make you the most uncomfortable. And he adds, they once were you, or will be you. Or by baking and giving away cookies, or by loving your enemies. When you live adventually by doing these things, you are the way that God is actually showing up in the midst of other people's lives, bringing them healing and wholeness, even in spite of all the stuff that they're dealing with. And the thing is, it's cyclical or it's repetitive. Because when you do that, when you are that present, when you live adventually, being God's advent for others, then you too catch a new glimpse, another new glimpse, or experience a new God's presence and God's activity. It's a both and. Eventually, we die. Adventually, we live. As we live with open hearts to receive and to embrace and to experience the one who came to us, quite frankly, in the most ordinary and mundane ways possible, in the little town of Bethlehem, away in a manger, overlooked by most, and whose teaching didn't fit with what people were expecting and hoping for. So again, overlooked or dismissed by most. And certainly whose cruel death on a cross confirmed to most that he was not the one. But he is. He is. And he is not to give us exactly what we want, what I want, what I expect, what you want or expect, but what you and I need the most. A restored and vibrant relationship with God, as God intended it from the very beginning. Life with God to be shared adventually and to be experienced adventually. Amen.